Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Scott, and good evening, everybody. I did want to say the next work group is going to start on July 10th, and it's part one, which is the healthy sexuality for men. Sorry, healthy intimacy skills for men in recovery. I'm teaching the part two right now, the sexuality. But the other one, the first part, intimacy, starts on July 10th, Monday evening. So yeah, so with that, let me talk about the topic. And a lot of the topics sort of come to me just based on different conversations with different people during the week. And this week, for some reason, I've heard a lot of people talk about just the idea of loneliness and being lonely. And so I wanted to just talk about that a little bit, how it plays out, what it looks like, what it can cause, and then most important, maybe things to do about it, ways we can approach it. But loneliness is something that we are, a lot of sociologists and social researchers are, there's survey after survey coming out that we are increasingly lonely as a people, as a country. Weirdly, the demographic that appears to be most hard hit is white men who are in middle age, in their 50s, 60s, who, and there's also, by the way, a spate of suicides at that level and so on. So it does impact everybody. And sometimes, in fact, a lot of times with these sociological phenomena, white men seem to be kind of sheltered from it, from some of the damage, but certainly not in this case. Loneliness is not something to be taken lightly either, because it can really cause a lot of physical consequences down the road. Like many of these emotional disorders, it plays out not only in our emotions and mental health, but in our physical health. So risk of stroke, risk of diabetes, risk of heart attack, even a premature death has been linked in some cases to loneliness. And so it's really something to look at. I think something to understand, because a lot of people get confused. How can I be lonely when I'm kind of surrounded by people all the time? And that's really one of the definitions of loneliness, is this feeling that you are really not connected and by yourself, even though you can be surrounded by people. You can be in the middle of a crowd. And I always like to distinguish with my own clients the distinction between loneliness and just alone time, right? That we need isolation sometimes. We need quiet time. We need time ourselves to reflect and think and meditate and just process life in many cases. And that's, I distinguish that because I think that's a positive mental health kind of pastime, as opposed to loneliness, which is this kind of emotional belief about oneself. And as I said, you can be lonely in a crowd. So to kind of talk about that, I have some I statements here that we hear typically with people that experience loneliness. I feel like I'm not important to anyone. I feel like nobody needs me. I feel like I don't really exist. So when we don't see ourselves reflected back in people around us, we can have this feeling like I'm just kind of nothing, a non-entity in ourselves, and we get even further then into our minds. I feel alone with myself, as another quote I hear a lot. I feel safer to be alone. Then I can't get rejected. Then I can't fill in the blank. Then I can't get hurt. Then I can't get disappointed, right? So oftentimes, based on bad experiences, we start to cut off people. We limit social contact. We protect ourselves. But unfortunately, those walls that we put up sometimes, and this happens a lot to children too, who are experience adverse childhood experiences, different kinds of abuse. They put up walls to protect themselves. Unfortunately, those walls also keep us inside and keep other people that may want to let in out. And so those walls can really end up not serving us very well. I feel like I don't have anyone to tell my good news to. I feel alone. I'm surrounded by people. I feel like no one understands me. I think, this is true for partners. This is true for addicts. When we talk about addiction in this sense, this kind of disconnect of emotional communication and feeling somebody gets me. I think one of the biggest factors in my own recovery was, for the first time, really, when I got into an AA meeting, first time in my life, feeling like this is a place I belong. I never felt that really in any other sphere in my life. And so that sense of belonging is really important. So what can we do about this? And this is a big problem. And we know, by the way, speaking of addiction and loneliness, that it can cause that. It can cause us to withdraw. It can cause us to shut down. It can cause us to limit social behavior for many reasons, right? Sometimes when I was drinking, I very carefully curated my friends because I wanted people that drank as much or worse than I did, because it made me feel better about my own problems, right? So I was kind of lonely by definition in there. But then even within that group of other drinkers and partiers, I felt very lonely itself. I felt really misunderstood and disconnected. So first thing, and we hear this all the time when we talk about connection being the essential feature of recovery from addiction. We need to reach out. And I think a lot of us, we need to reach out in real time. We need to have real conversations with real people. All those 8,000 Facebook friends that we have are not going to do much good if we're lonely. And there's a bunch of other, I didn't even get into that tonight, a bunch of social media studies that talk about loneliness and social media, which is, and other things, by the way, that we all have heard about, body image and so on. So start a conversation, and this is where I think it's really up to us, because sometimes loneliness, which, by the way, I didn't even talk about this, can be a symptom of depression. It could be a symptom of dementia. It can be a symptom of all kinds of things. But if it's involved with depression, we can get low energy. We can start to cut ourselves off. We can start to kind of disconnect, either because it takes the energy, it takes psychic energy and physical energy to make those outreach calls. And it takes some good feeling about ourselves to feel worth it sometimes. A lot of times people hit a point where they don't even feel worth reaching out. But my point here is to reach out in real time, send a text, make a phone call if you have to. Better yet, see somebody in person, have coffee, have lunch, go to a meeting, stay for fellowship. After the meetings, this is a mistake I made for the first couple of months of my own sobriety. As soon as the meeting ended, I was out the door as fast as I could, as fast as I could run. And there's a slogan, like there's many slogans in 12-step program, but the one that, that comes to mind here is that the meeting after the meeting, right? The fellowship that occurs after the meeting. And once I started doing that, at very strong urging from my sponsor, that's when I really started to make contact and really started to feel the benefits of social connection from the program. So yes, stay, send texts, make calls, that's all fine, but try to meet in person whenever you can. When you do go on social media, and I think it's impossible to say stay off social media, although it probably would do us all good. But if you're on social media, rather than just scrolling through stuff, reading your news feeds, looking what your friends are doing, use social media as a way to find events or meetings that you might like to go to, different kind of things that may be going on in your area. Use it as a way to connect with other people and set up plans to meet in person. So in other words, use social media as a means to an end. And that end would be actually connecting in real life, not just as a place to go where you kind of can kill hours just scrolling through without much good. And by the way, when we're scrolling, it's not just kind of a neutral activity. When we're scrolling, we're starting to compare ourselves. We're thinking, remember, when people post on social media, it's all the good stuff, right? It's euphoric recall in a way. And what we're seeing when people post on social media is their curated image of their lives. And we start to compare, as one friend of mine says often, we compare our insides to other people's outsides. We know how we feel on the inside, but we're not seeing that from social media posts. And I personally know a lot of people who've been in tremendous emotional pain, but when they post on Facebook, it's all happy and wonderful and they're having a fabulous life. And that's not the truth. And if we assume everybody else is having a fabulous life and we're not, that sets us up for a lot of problems, including loneliness. So reach out and use social media as a means to an end, but not as an end in of itself. Service. This was a huge way that I, again, at the urging of my first sponsor, really started to connect with people, and it got me out of myself. I made coffee at meetings. I cleaned up at meetings. I did anything I could do for meetings. And later that kind of service commitment expanded into other areas, nonprofits and so on in the town where I live, work in the community. But I think anything you do to do service is really helpful to break that sense of loneliness, because you have a purpose, you have a mission, and it's great work, and you can feel good about yourself. And by the way, during the pandemic, a lot of places started doing work online, to service commitments online for not-for-profits. And so although I urge real life connection, even online service is better than nothing. So look for opportunities for that as well. The third area I'd really emphasize here is self-care. And if we're experiencing loneliness as part of a depressive disorder or an anxiety disorder, it may be that our self-care is really kind of limited and impaired in many ways. We may have those negative core beliefs that we're not worthy of it, we're not deserving, all the negative stuff that fills our mind sometimes. So really self-care is really important. And obviously we know it, we know physical self-care and getting sleep, hydrated, getting adequate nutrition, the emotional self-care, the connection and all that. spiritual self-care, even just connecting to something greater than you. But in that, I would really have a tone, if you will, with your interactions with yourself, of compassion. We are so hard on ourselves, and I think the sometimes more depressed we get, the more lonely we get, the harder we are on ourselves. So that idea of compassion that we always talk about, extending toward other people, and kindness, which we need more of, we certainly need more of it for ourselves too. So don't forget yourself when you're spreading compassion around the world. Be gentle with yourself, because we're human beings having a human experience here, and we're flawed sometimes, and we make mistakes, and we're not perfect, and that's how we learned. That's okay, but we can be so critical and hard on ourselves. That self-care is just really, really important. And then finally, and this is, I guess, the obvious one, therapy, right? We don't have to solve our problems on ourselves. I think sometimes we're not capable of having all that insight that we need on our own. I always recommend peer groups, even therapy groups, anything where we can see and get feedback from people that we trust, where it's safe, where they can give us realistic feedback. So they can point out if they see something we can improve, and they can point out when we're doing something well, and hopefully we can start to hear that and believe it. So just a couple of things to finish this up in terms of belief. We have these I am statements, a lot of negative ones. I think that there's some ones that I would try to reinstill or create in your life for the first time. First of all, is that we're not alone. Remember that loneliness is a universal experience. If you're in a room full of people, there's probably more than half, if not everybody in that room, is also experiencing loneliness right at that moment. And so this idea that we're the only ones experiencing that is a real mistake. It's a universal experience. It's part of the human condition, if you will. We're cared for. I think if we can just see it, sometimes we don't care for ourselves very well. Sometimes we don't believe it, that we're worthy of care. But I think if we open ourselves up in the right environments and safe environments, like most meetings, therapy groups, and so on, we are cared for. And I think I was kind of the last one to see that in my own life. I think we don't believe it. We don't believe we're worthy. There's all these beliefs that kind of interfere with that. But there are people out there that are really kind of hold our space and carry us until we can do it ourselves and see it ourselves. I think that's really important to remember. Remember that we deserve good stuff, right? We deserve quality relationships. We deserve positive feedback. We deserve respect and to be treated well, and all those things that we sometimes put off, and I think or don't really believe about ourselves. Emotions. I think sometimes we feel that we may be cut off from people who are lonely because we don't know how to handle our emotions well, or we don't even know what we're feeling at times. So really start to practice with the feelings. This is something makes our clients crazy, I'm sure, because with the feeling wheels and the emojis and all that, but it's really important to start to have an understanding of feelings. And to remember then that we're allowed to have feelings. We're allowed to open up. We're allowed to make mistakes. All those permissions that maybe we hadn't gotten ever in our lifetimes. We may have to do that for ourselves. We may have to re-adult, or that word, the verb now we hear, adulting, right? Adulting is hard work, but we may have to kind of do that for the first time for ourselves, because our parents may be gone, our parents are not in the thing, but we have to reparent us. And so there's always that inner child we talk about, but that inner child almost, the concept really demands that we also recognize the other part of that, which is the adult, right? We have both parts. And I think to really awaken the adult in our lives, in ourselves, and really use that to advantage. So I think bottom line, we have more skills to combat loneliness than we may think. And in many ways, it's a mindset, it's a frame of seeing the world, and that we can change those things, and we can change habits, and we can start to make improvement. And it may not happen all at once, but as I noted in my own life with recovery, during different kinds of things we do in service and healing, it changes, and it changes consistently if we just put in full work. So I think with that, I'll stop. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I see somebody has done the digital hand raise. This is a webinar, so if you have a question, just type it into the Q&A feature, and we will answer questions that way. Great topic, David. When I work with addicts, particularly when we're talking about the cycle of addiction, and I ask them, what are the emotional triggers for you, and almost every time I teach one of those classes, the first thing out of somebody's mouth is lonely. Um, Loneliness is a massive trigger toward addiction, particularly for sex and porn addicts. And as you were reading off some of the beliefs, the one that hits home with the addicts always is, I feel safer alone. Other people are dangerous. Other people can hurt me. Other people can reject me. And unfortunately, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. I don't trust other people, so I don't become around other people. Then I feel lonely, and then I feel uncomfortable in my own skin. It just spins. There's the great TED Talk with Johann Hari about, I think it's called "Everything You Thought You Knew About Addiction Is Wrong," and he talks
Exactly
about,
right.
the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, it's connection. Can you talk a little bit about some of the things he discusses in that video? I think he talks about the rat part, maybe. I don't know. I can't remember if he talks about Portugal or not, but can you run through some of that?
Yeah, just it's a wonderful TED Talk for people that haven't seen it. It is called "Everything You Know About Addiction Is Wrong" by Johann Hari, Hari. And his tagline there is, the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, the opposite of addiction is connection. And he goes through very quickly some key research about addiction. And starting in the 70s with the Partnership for Drug-Free America, basically put a rat in a cage with a bottle of plain water and a bottle of cocaine-laced water. And the rat in this kind of cage all by itself, guess what? He drank the cocaine water and then died. And so the conclusion was that cocaine will kill you and any other drug will kill you, and there's no other factor involved in the development of addiction except the drug itself. And what happened in the 90s, another guy named Bruce Alexander, a researcher up in British Columbia, recreated the experiment, but this time he called it Rat Park. He didn't have a solitary rat in a cage with two tubes of liquid. He had a rat in a cage with other rats and little nooks and crannies and little shrubs and food and rat toys and little rat Ferris wheel things they could play on. And guess what? When the rat was in community, when the rat had connection, they were far less likely to drink the drug-laced water. They might have tried it. It didn't appeal. They didn't go for it. And even the rats that had relapsed in the old experiment, because he recreated that as well, they didn't use the drugs in this rat park. So the conclusion, and it's the correct one, I think, is that the drugs are significant. They're not the whole story. Yeah, drugs are dangerous, but why do some people, and the example he uses, by the way, is in Vietnam, when a significant number of, I don't know, like 70%, I think is the number I've heard of soldiers, GIs over in Vietnam were using heroin. And there was a huge panic that when they came back, we're going to have all these heroin addicts all over the street. When they came back, yeah, we had some, but the vast majority of veterans came back and just stopped using, because the drug use was very much associated with the kind of dismay and boredom and terror of being in Vietnam. And it didn't match once they were back in their lives. And so I think that's an incredibly important awareness. So yeah, loneliness is a key factor here. And I think it's both the precursor to addiction and the result of addiction. It's on both sides of addiction. But I think in recovery, we certainly have to kind of combat that, because we need each other in a much more significant way than I think we understood before. And since that Bruce Alexander research, by the way, there's been other research that really validated this idea that connection and social connection and how we network with each other and our support groups, and the more robust they are, the stronger our recovery. So yeah, it's a brilliant TED Talk, and there's a lot more research beyond what he talks about, but it's really recommended because he lays it out in a crystal clear way that we really need each other for recovery.
Yeah, and beyond that research, I mean, I can just describe my own 12-step group experience. And David, I'm sure you see this as well. The people in 12-step groups who are most likely to stay sober are the ones who show up 10 minutes early and they stay for the whole meeting, and they either sit around and chat in the parking lot for 10 or 15 minutes, or they go to coffee or dinner afterward. Because they feel connected. And in particular, they feel connected with people who understand them, people who get them, people who speak their language, basically. I remember going to meetings and being shocked that other people had the same feelings I had, the
Me
loneliness, the
too.
feeling uncomfortable in their own skin, the feeling of being, at a crowded party where they know everyone and still feeling all alone and left out and weird and, out of place. And I was like, oh my God, these are my people. And that because of that, I actually felt it made it easier for me to open up and join the fellowship. I mean, I always think there are three parts to a 12-step program: the meeting itself, the steps, the actual work of the 12 steps, and then the fellowship. And I think they're all equally important, and maybe the most important is the fellowship, for a lot of reasons. Number one, it helps me feel less lonely. When I'm less lonely, I'm less likely to drink or act out or use. And number two, if I'm hanging out with sober people, I'm less likely to drink or act out or use. If I hang out at a barbershop, I'm going to get a haircut eventually.
Right. For sure. And the other thing I'll just say, because it's a thing that happens, and we see it with our clients seeking integrity all the time, is that at least among guys, we don't have the experience of having many male friendships.
Right.
And people that go through seeking integrity are, I mean, universally kind of surprised and delighted that they're walking away with something they didn't expect. Not only, some recovery skills and some recovery under their belt, but good male friends. And one after the other, gay, straight, it doesn't matter. These guys will talk about it. I haven't really had good friends before where I could be this honest or I could be this open and vulnerable. And it feels good. And we know that men and women, need friends, same gender friends, non-sexual friends, just to talk and relate to. So that's another big factor, I think, with really working a program of recovery is creating those friendships.
Yeah, that's one of the true gifts of recovery that I had no interest in when I came in. I'm like, I don't want to hang out with these people. I don't need friends. I don't need. It's one of the things
Are these people
that I'm most grateful for is I have some friends, and like you, I mean, when I do the online work groups, I'll have maybe 20 guys in there. I'll say I'll say who has a best friend, and about 5 guys will raise their hand, and I say, okay, if your best friend knows what you're doing right now and why, you can leave your hand up, and all the hands go down. I'm like, okay, guys, you don't have a best friend. You have acquaintances. Best friends know about your deepest, darkest secrets. And it's something that hardly any men, or at least any men who are not in recovery, have. I can't speak for women. I think women are actually better at,
I think women are far better. I agree. They tend to process things with their friends, whereas men, we may play sports or something and kind of maybe talk about something at the service level, but never really get into the deep.
Never have anybody know the real you. And this is why, I mean, you mentioned particularly men in their 50s and 60s are the people hardest hit by loneliness, even though we won't admit it most of the time. Right. It's, we were taught and socialized, to fix it ourselves, do it on our own.
And where does it go? It goes into porn addiction and sex addiction, all the other addictive behaviors. Right. That's what gets changed. So I think it's a major factor, especially with sex and porn addiction, major one.
Yeah. So I want some airtime today. Okay, let's jump into the questions here. Type your questions into the Q&A feature. We got plenty of time today. So hi, this is from the addict. I'm 8 months sober with some slips on YouTube. I'm part of a 12-step group and finally taking it seriously and looking for a sponsor. I have read many books and seen a therapist once. I also have seen a coach many times. I'm still battling with fantasy almost every day. I can't afford a CSAT, but I'm very open-minded. What is your opinion on controlling fantasy? What a great question. And I'll let David hit it first, and then I'll certainly jump in on this one.
Yeah, so I admire everything you're doing. I think it's really important. Although, finally take it seriously. I'll just stay there. That's good. That's really good because we need to obviously take it seriously. It's too bad that you can't get more therapy sessions in your life. I think that would be very beneficial, but I understand that that can be very problematic with people. So when it comes to fantasy, I think this is something that we see really hanging on. I run a chemsex support group on Tuesday nights on seeking sexual relationship healing on the same site. And one of the guys there has many years of clean time from meth, and is still struggling with fantasy almost on a daily basis to the point of despair. And he's had like 8 years of white knuckling sobriety, and that's really hard. And so there's a couple of things that go with fantasy. I think one is we have to be kind of willing to let it go. The more we indulge in it, the stronger it gets and the more of a presence it is. And it's a habit. Fantasy, when we constantly go toward these fantasies, and they evolve over time as we escalate in our addiction, but as we kind of go through these fantasies, they become basically kind of hardwired in our brain, meaning that our brain goes there automatically whether we want it to or not. And in early recovery, many people will end up in fantasy and have to kind of pull themselves out because their brain has taken them there, because we taught our brain to take us there when we were in our addiction. And so that's been a real problem for people. So I think fantasy is a huge issue to kind of struggle with. I think one of the best ways, frankly, is to distract yourself. I think once you're in it in that automatic way, or if you're on the edge of getting into it, it can be really problematic. And I think one of the ways that we can do it is to really distract ourselves. And I would do that, the same techniques we talked about tonight for loneliness. Make a call, reach out, go to a meeting, get out of your head, get out of yourself. Remember, fantasies exist in our heads. And so I think if we can do something physical, if we can do something social, all those things help to counteract it and combat it. We also know that fantasy, and this is kind of a latter day awareness because of really high-powered scanning ability we now have people's brains, we know that fantasy is nearly as bad as actually acting out in terms of releasing dopamine. So we have guys that are just porn addicts, for example, or just guys that have, not even porn, but not porn, right? Looking at Facebook, Instagram, they're getting the dopamine from that as if they were a porn addict. They are a porn addict. They're just having different ways of triggering it. And so I think we need to just get really clean in the kinds of stuff we're looking at, the kinds of stuff we're thinking about. One of the problems that guys often have, and this is especially true with chemsex, and I think this is the problem maybe with the guy that I was speaking about last night, is that chemsex and a lot of sex and porn addicts, especially as we get older, in recovery, it's really hard to have a strong erection. It's really hard to have an orgasm sometimes. And so out of frustration, out of wanting to please their partner, out of just sometimes wanting to put this thing to an end, let's get this over with, they just for the briefest moment will think about some sex addiction fantasy, just to kind of, because that's still the high-powered, bright, shiny object in their arousal template. And so they go for that. But unfortunately, every time they do that, they're reinforcing the fantasy itself. So they're what you want to do is put distance between yourself and that fantasy. And that really is about letting that grow over, letting that fantasy get kind of covered up and gone. We know in our arousal template, we can't ever really get rid of them, but we can let them go dormant. And to do that, though, we have to distract ourselves with other things. We have to create new new erotic interests, if you will, to go on. And that usually is a slow process. But fantasy, the more we indulge in it, the stronger it gets. And so just to avoid it, if you can. And as I say, your brain may take you there automatically, and then you have to pull yourself out, but you don't want to spend time in it. It's not a good place to be. It's a slippery slope.
Yeah, thank you for bringing up not porn, because there's porn and then there's not porn, which is technically not porn, but we use it like it's porn. And a lot of guys actually prefer not porn because it leaves more to the imagination, like a bikini pic or something like that, leaves more to the imagination. And this is the sex organ, not down there. The brain is the sex organ. And that's also where the high of sex addiction occurs. I mentioned the cycle of addiction earlier. We get triggered by something like loneliness, which is our topic today. And the first stage of moving into the addiction is we slide into fantasy. And usually we're not even aware we're doing it. Sometimes we consciously slide into fantasy, but usually we just kind of slide. And as sex addicts and porn addicts, it will be a sexual fantasy. And with that, we start elevating our dopamine level and our adrenaline level. And And then we start taking steps toward acting out. Every time we take a step, we bump up the dopamine and adrenaline a little more, and then eventually we act out. But we can stay in this fantasy-induced high for hours, days even. We call it the bubble, or we call it the trance. You know, I always picture myself in the big fishbowl. It's me and my sexual fantasy, and nothing bad happens. There's no loneliness. There's no boredom. Everybody's gorgeous. Everybody says yes. Nobody has bad breath.
No vulnerability.
No vulnerability. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, you know, it's a pure fantasy, but it gets us high the same as drugs get us high. I mean, it literally is the same neurochemical reaction. And fantasy will do this. Fantasy is absolutely part of this addiction. And you know, we don't have to see porn to see porn. We don't have to see not porn to see not porn. We have a brain, and it remembers, and it can turn some, you know, random person, you know, that we see walking down the street. We can make a movie out of it. Yeah, I'm super glad you're aware that fantasy is keeping your addiction alive right now, because it is. In addition to the tools David gave, I recommend the 3-second rule, particularly with fantasy. Second number one, oh, I'm objectifying that person, or I'm having a sexual fantasy. You know, second number two, turn away. Second number three is either humanize the person that you're objectifying, or just think about something else, anything else. You know, the score of last night's game, whatever. We have to be our own thought police, though. And you know, if you're struggling with this, I encourage you to kind of keep a little notepad with you for a week, and sort of just like write down the time of day every time you catch yourself in a fantasy. And it's kind of shocking how often we slide there. So, and it also helps us become aware, oh, this fantasy, I don't need to be here. So anyway.
Also, I think that awareness of it, just that exercise, makes you more likely to understand what caused it. What tripped this thing off? Was it loneliness? Was it fear, anger, you know, whatever? But when we become aware of the spark that caused it to go. You know, I had another thought, Scott, where you're talking about the work groups you do, and other folks that Seek Integrity are so valuable, and they're affordable. Maybe this person, if they can't afford a therapist, might be able to do a work group on porn, or Sex Addiction 101, or one of the ones that were relevant.
Yeah, if you identify as a porn addict, I'd love to see you in the porn addiction work group. I think the next one starts June 24th. And I think I have a sex addiction work group starting that same day. That's Saturday mornings. One is at 7, the other's at 9 Pacific. So yeah. Okay, next question. What about the spouse feeling lonely? The spouse is not the addict. So I'm not sure what the specific is, but what is, you know, do betrayed partners also get affected by loneliness, and what happens to them? As addicts, we go to our addiction. What do betrayed partners do?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. You know, loneliness is not just the domain of the addict. Loneliness runs through, well, society, but certainly through the partners. I mean, it's part of the addiction as well, whether you're a partner or the addict themselves. And the partners experience it maybe more profoundly, because the sense of there's an aspect of betrayal here where people have been feeling kind of connected, and as if their life is kind of all solid and in order, and very often the rug gets pulled out from under them because with the discovery of some kind, or a shock of this revelation. And so I think just that can sort of thrust them into this feeling of loneliness, and it has all these other companions that ride along with it, right? And for the partner, I think there's a lot of shame, as there is for the addict, but shame about what does this mean for you know, my family? Who's going to find out about this? Whether it's family, friends, community, and so on. There's a lot of anger. There's a lot of fear. What does this mean? So I think, and a lot of times people will resist talking about it because of that shame factor. They kind of keep it a secret. And I think one of the unfortunate things is that with people kind of intuitively know people will judge them for this, so they feel they will, and so they hold back. And I think that's where, again, the same principles of connecting and reaching out and showing up and having conversations are equally beneficial for the partners here. Their strategies may be different. They may, you know, become, you know, super sleuths trying to get information. We know one of the strategies of trying to recreate some kind of sense of emotional safety for the partner is to understand what is going on here, and how bad is this, and how far does it go, and so they start looking for information, and they become very good at it. My experience with that, by the way, is that unfortunately there's never enough information to really make the anxiety go away, because they can find out everything, but they don't know they've found everything, and they might think there's something else. And so it's kind of a never-ending cycle of anxiety and fear, which also I think can lead to loneliness, because they start to become preoccupied with this incident and this problem and this situation, and how much is there, and how bad is it, and all that. And so I think they have their own kind of roller coaster, certainly their own kind of swirl of different feelings, but my God, the same phenomenon of loneliness certainly does apply. And the same tools we talked about too, reaching out, self-care, core beliefs, all those things are equally powerful for the partner in recovery.
Yeah, thank you. This next question, I tend to act out when I'm alone. I think I'm afraid of being alone, as well as afraid of acting out. I think this is more due to my Parkinson's. Any ideas on what I can do to help myself when my wife has a doctor's appointment or whatever? So this is somebody with Parkinson's who acts out when he's alone, but he's also afraid of being alone, which I think he's saying that's related to his Parkinson's, which is certainly understandable. So any ideas there, David?
Yeah, I think anytime we have some other medical condition, I think that can contribute to this sense of loneliness and disconnect sometimes. And I think, and sometimes it's just sort of being equivalent or keeping up with our friends with activities, or just feeling frail at home and not wanting to be alone like that. So sometimes there's really good reasons to need people around besides just this emotional connection. But I think in this case, a lot of the tools we talked about would be equally effective, right? Maybe there are people I don't know if you're in any kind of support group. I know they do exist for Parkinson's, where you could find other people in this situation who would understand, much like the addict who finds solace in another 12-step meeting, because we can see people and meet people there that identify with us. They understand us, they get us. And so there might be a Parkinson's support group or allies, people with it, or caregivers or whatever that you could connect with if you're not already, and really use those people to kind of create a social support network for yourself. And I think that's one way for sure. And then out of that, just like in 12-step meetings, I think people can find people that become sort of closer friends and come to one's home and visit each other and that sort of thing. There might be people that could grow out of a support network like that, who could show up for you. But yeah, I think it's a difficult circumstance, although again, you're not alone. You're not unique in that. There's a lot of people with things. A lot of people who are housebound, who can't get out and have to find a way to kind of manage this sense of isolation and loneliness and feeling different and shame and all the other stuff we pile on top of ourselves when we're going through these situations. But I would apply the same principles to look for people that understand you, and that probably is going to be a support group or some kind of Parkinson's support agency, and try to connect with them and get the support there, because they do understand.
Yeah, absolutely. I love, this is actually two questions, and I love them both here, and they definitely go together. Hi, Dr. Fawcett, can you explain fetishes, kinks, and when it's healthy and when it's not? And then the second question is any modification in the arousal template unnatural?
Yeah, so this is interesting, because when we talk about kinks and fetishes and paraphilias and so on, there's kind of a clinical definition and there's popular definitions. But so kinks and fetishes have been kind of, in the popular language, kind of become one and the same in a way. A kink is kind of anything that is a little bit out of the normal, that maybe not everybody does, that kind of adds a little extra spark to your erotic life. And there's nothing wrong with any of this, as long as it's two adults who are consenting, right? That's the issue here. Fetishes become maybe a little bit more formed than a kink in my mind of fetishes. Literally, by the way, the fetishes in the beginning were designed to be attractions to something that was non-human. So leather or stiletto heels or chains or things that weren't already. Now we kind of, and again, in the popular use of it, we look at people objectifying, body parts, for example. That can be fetishized, if you will, and we use that word to describe that. But it's something that that is there. Now there can be people who are kind of take it or leave a kink or fetish, that they don't need it in their sexual life. There are other people who are dependent on it, and so there's some variation there. Then the final kind of most I guess extreme thing would be, I guess, what we call paraphilia, which is where it really gets more extreme, more unusual, maybe more dangerous for that matter. There are certain paraphilias, like any kind of breath control, that I think are just not ever safe under any circumstances. So there's things like that. Interestingly, until 2015, when the DSM-5 came out, which is our diagnostic manual, paraphilias were still considered a mental illness. Those were just removed finally in 2015, and that's a good thing. What's still in there, by the way, for any of this, kinks, fetishes, paraphilias, is any kind of ego dystonic feelings about it. That means, yeah, I have this fetish, I have this kink, but I really don't like it. It really upsets me. I'm very disturbed about it. And so a therapist can work with that client on their feeling of being disturbed by it, but it's really considered basically unethical and in some states illegal to work on changing that, because they basically can't be changed. Once stuff's in the arousal template like that, it's there. We can't really undo it, but we can help the person kind of make peace with that and figure out how they're going to live with that or not. The other thing I'll say just is to overlap with addiction. We sometimes get guys coming seeking integrity who, as a result of their escalation in their sex addiction, have now started being attracted to and having sex with transgender women, for example. These are heterosexual guys who, in the course of their escalation and development, have basically started finding an erotic interest in transgender women. And so, of course, am I gay? Their wives are asking, is he gay? And maybe a small percentage that might be uncovering something that was all along, but there's a lot of reasons, for example, why men sleep with other men, right? It may not be just homosexuality. It may be convenience. It may be a fetish like this. It may be other things. That said, these same guys often come into treatment thinking this fetish is part of my sex addiction. And if I get sober, it's going to go away. And the problem is that once we have things in our arousal template, they're basically there. And so those things don't go away. So we have to make a distinction between what is the addiction, what's a symptom of the addiction, and what is the arousal template, and what something gets put into the arousal template, it's kind of there permanently. So maybe that's way too much information on this question, but I think it's important to talk about and kind of the limits of it and how it expresses itself sometimes with guys coming into treatment.
Yeah, and the way this last bit is worded, is any modification in the arousal template unnatural? And I mean, my answer is no, because we don't necessarily, as adults, we don't particularly modify our arousal template. I think we uncover pre-existing latent arousal elements. And pornography is the king of doing this. You see it and it's like, oh my God, people are into that. I had no idea. And I find it kind of hot. Didn't know it was a thing. This is what happens to a lot of guys. They stumble on transgender porn or something like that. And, there's, very few people are 100% straight or 100% gay. Most people are on that continuum, and they just uncover something that's on the continuum that they weren't aware of. What I can tell you is, if it's not in the arousal template at all, porn is not going to uncover it. I'm 100% gay. I mean, I'm a Kinsey 6 all the way. You could show me naked women from now until doomsday, and I'm not going to get aroused. It's not in my arousal template. There's a lot of stuff in my arousal template I wish I wasn't there. But an attraction to women, sorry, ladies, I know I'm a catch. Sorry, ladies, it's not in there for me. if it's at all in there, even latently, we can certainly uncover it. I don't think that makes it unnatural in any way.
I agree with that totally, Scott. The one thing I would say about this question, when a child experiences abuse, especially sexual abuse, that can really damage, and sometimes the word they talk about is hijack the arousal template. It does affect the arousal template for life. Even if they have trauma work and get over the trauma of it, aspects of that experience are going to be in their arousal template. And we see sometimes people recreating this as adults and that sort of thing. So, and certainly the child had no choice in that. That's the closest I can think of to becoming unnatural, because it was kind of imposed on the person. But otherwise, stuff is in there, and we're kind of wired. And as Scott said, I think things get revealed, and you worded it beautifully. That's hot. I never thought of that before, and I didn't know that was a thing. And that's exactly right.
Yeah, the caveat for what I said is, as adults, we uncover. As kids, I think the arousal template is more malleable, and definitely trauma. There's no question trauma plays in to the early development of an arousal template. My husband, go ahead.
I was going to say, when we're talking about addiction and escalation, and these are all things, it's just escalating what's already in there in a way. The form it takes may be different. Right. We may do things we never did before, but it's the same core scripts are there that are being acted out in different ways.
Yeah. And what we learn in sobriety is, just because it's in our arousal template doesn't mean we have to act on it.
That's right.
So, and that's a big distinction there. Okay. My husband became involved in chat rooms, porn, emotional affairs after he developed erectile dysfunction. He said he was too embraced to turn to me, too embarrassed maybe to turn to me for sex because he could not get an erection. Do you think this is common for men, or is this just a form of justification? He said the more he did this, the more he could not stop. This has been over 3 years. He does some recovery, but not good recovery. David, I don't know.
Yeah, okay. I guess what I would say to this sounds like something we tell ourselves when we are trying to rationalize an addiction.
Yeah, your addict's full of crap.
That's another way of saying that. I think, if anything, we do see erectile dysfunction in a role here with porn, but we see porn causing it as opposed to the way around. And we see often guys that can get no problem with getting erections when they're looking at porn, but they have a lot of trouble with their wife or their girlfriend, and so, or boyfriend. And so I think this seems like a big rationalization to me. There are other ways of dealing with erectile dysfunction, by the way. It is somewhat treatable, but porn is not one of those strategies.
We called it, as I was reading this, I was like, he has porn-induced erectile dysfunction. He was looking at porn before he developed ED. He got the ED because he was looking at, now I don't know.
And that makes it hard to function with his wife.
Right, which makes it hard to function with you. Then it becomes an excuse. He needs to get away from the porn. And David mentioned there are treatments for erectile dysfunction, but porn-induced erectile dysfunction does not particularly respond to those treatments, because things like Viagra, they work on the genitalia, whereas this porn-induced erectile dysfunction is not a problem with the genitalia. It's not a medical problem. It's not a physical problem. It's an emotional and psychological problem. It's up in the brain. And the only cure for that is to stay away from porn for, pretty much permanently. And it still takes 6, 8, 9, 12 months for the brain to reset.
At least 6. And just to underscore what you just said, because it's exactly right. It starts up here. The brain is the biggest sex organ, and with sex addiction and porn addiction, we reset, as I mentioned, that the baseline minimum level we need of arousal intensity we need to get aroused is so high that we can't meet that in certainly in our marriages or in the real world, basically. And so that spark that goes, the signal from the brain saying, I'm aroused, let's do this, it never arrives. And as Scott mentioned, those medications, erectile dysfunction medications, work in the genitalia. So if the signal never arrives, they're not going to have any power at all. They don't do anything. And so, it's a big problem for that.
Yeah, and one of the really, really crummy things about like porn-induced erectile dysfunction, and sex addicts in general also struggle with erectile dysfunction. It's not just the porn
Right.
addicts. Um, is that often the betrayed partners wonder if they're just not as attractive as they used to be, or I gained 10 pounds, maybe, it's like, or am I too much of a nag, or they start blaming themselves for something that is absolutely not their fault. And when we question the guys, do you still find your wife attractive? Oh my God, she's beautiful. Do you still love her? Oh yes. Do you want to have? Oh yes, I want to be sexual with her. I just can't function, and it does cause a lot of shame and embarrassment. But it also, it's fixable, but it's fixable with sobriety,
Right.
unless it is a medical issue. Um, but typically it isn't.
Right.
I mean, we see this issue with 20-year-olds. It's
Right.
not just the 7-year-olds.
Right.
So, hello, Dr. Fawcett. I am a chemsex addict, sober from chemsex for 3 years. Congratulations. I'm still struggling with porn and not porn. I work from home and always with my partner, which helps me stay sober. But I fear that if I get alone time for a few days, boredom and loneliness will lead me to act out. I still miss those feelings. I assume the high. What is stopping my progress in recovery? I do the 12 steps. I have CSAT, a sponsor, a circle plan. But still, I feel like I can't be left alone at all. Wonderful self-awareness, and congratulations on the chemsex sobriety.
For
Um,
sure. For
but
sure.
David, yeah, porn.
Yeah. So, I mentioned earlier, I think colleagues, or rather clients I've had who would be sober from taking drugs or acting out, but still struggling with the fantasy. And I think this is a case where whatever porn or not porn you're looking at is continuing that fantasy. And so you're still, the addiction is still kind of, I was going to say an idol. It's probably even more than idol. It's kind of revved up a little bit from the porn. So I think you're going to continue to have problems until you can really get sober from the porn and not porn, because that's really keeping you're locking yourself into that kind of preoccupied phase of the addiction cycle, right? Where you're kind of thinking about it, and the only thing that's not happening is you're not finishing it by acting out, which is a good thing. But I think you're very much holding yourself back. And I like the self-awareness, like Scott said, and I like that as well, because it's your brain, whenever you're doing that, is in fantasy. And that's kind of taking you out of natural processes you need to get into recovery. So I would really focus on looking at porn. If you're not in an S program, a sex addiction program, I would really incorporate that. And I recommend that for every chemsex client, by the way, because there are two strategies, right? There's usually abstinence from substances, but we don't want abstinence from sex. That's not the goal. The goal is to bring sex back into our life, but in a healthy way. And I think porn is preventing you from kind of moving into that direction completely. I'm glad your partner's around, but as you say, there's times when that's not going to be the case. And loneliness, boredom, even hotel rooms, all that stuff is deadly for sex addicts, right? Because that's the context in which this all occurs. So I think you're right to be leery of the situation, but I think it's up to you. It's not just the situation. It's up to you to keep like Scott said, to kind of be your thought police and to really put down the porn, because that's not doing you any good at all. I think it's really stopping your progress.
Yeah. I think it's possible to be a porn addict without engaging in other sexual behaviors. In my experience, it's not possible to be a sex addict without also having a problem with porn, not in today's day and age. So for you to be sober and for your brain to heal, as it's much harder for the brain to heal with chemsex, it's going to require staying away from porn and not porn as well. And that may mean getting off of social media, staying off of YouTube, sites like OnlyFans, definitely not. Instagram, definitely not. TikTok, no. I mean, these things, I know they're social media, but they would not exist if people weren't putting sexy pictures and videos on them.
That's right.
They would disappear like that. Stay away from them. Um,
And
Go ahead, David, and I have another question for you.
yeah, okay. I was going to say, I don't know if this is the case for this person or not, but often I see chemsex addicts, and when you, as I said, when you give up the drug, especially meth and cocaine, very often your sexual arousal just goes with it for a long time, months sometimes, which is not healthy, but it does. It's a factor of those two things being fused. Sometimes I see, and I don't know if this is going on or not, but sometimes I see guys looking at porn, kind of indulging on purpose in those fantasies just to keep their sexual arousal level high. And then somewhat they can maybe function with their partner, often thinking about fantasy and porn when they're with their partner. But sometimes chemsex addicts do this to kind of have some sense of sexual arousal and feelings. Otherwise, it's just kind of there's nothing. So, but the problem with that, if we do that, it just delays the real healing. That's the problem.
Yeah, it's better to just walk through the sexual desert for 6 months or 9 months or whatever it is, and come out the other side with the brain that is back to a normal baseline or normal for the individual, and where the sex drive will naturally come back instead of having to be, artificially induced, basically.
Right.
Does the craving, because he says, I still miss those feelings, and I'm assuming that's the high, does the craving for the high ever go away for any addict? I mean, let alone a chemsex addict.
I think I can't say that it really totally goes away. I think it fades. I guess I would say it goes dormant, if you will, to some extent. With distance, I really have no desire or craving for drugs anymore, but it's been a long time.
Yeah.
But I think somehow the intensity of sex and porn addiction lays down kind of a brighter attraction that may be harder to go away from. But I think if we pay attention to it, it just gets stronger. I don't know that it's ever totally gone. I just think we can bring it back to life if we're not careful. And if we give it attention, if we give it any oxygen at all, it's a survivor. It'll stay with us and grow.
Yeah. What I'll say for me, as a sex addict, and David's a chemical guy, not a sex addict. I am a sex addict. The craving for sex, the lustful craving for sex, has greatly diminished. What still comes back and hits me is the craving for escape, the emotional escape. If I'm having a bad day, I still want to escape emotionally. I don't go straight to sex like I used to. I'll look in the cabinet for Oreos first, or what. I still sometimes want to escape. And I think that sticks around, but I also think that's sort of part of the human condition. Sometimes it's like, oh, I'm having a crummy day. I'd really rather be somewhere else doing something else.
Which, kind of brings us full circle back to the beginning, right? Where we're talking about some of the things to do with loneliness, about reaching out, going to a meeting, make physical contact, self-care, all those things. Yeah. Because I agree with you, Scott. I think that the emotional triggers to act out or get into our addictions remain, and we have to use other strategies besides addiction to deal with them, healthier ones.
Yeah, I mean, the strategies for dealing with loneliness, loneliness is one of the huge triggers. There are also strategies for dealing with any addiction, craving, or anything. So yeah, we have several questions left. We're out of time. So I'm going to copy these and paste them into a little document. I'm going to save them for next week. And these will be the first questions we deal with next week. They're excellent questions. So come back next week and we will do those as our very first questions. David, great topic today. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for being here and for really good questions. And we're going to, like I said, there's a few
insightful questions. Really impressive.
Yeah. Anything you want to say to take us out, David?
Just the skills that we talked about for loneliness, like you just said, are applicable to everything, emotional issues, addiction issues, and so on. Just we need to kind of be kinder to ourselves and have more human connection.
Yeah. Okay, everybody, thank you for being here. See you next week. David, thank you as always. We'll see you next week.
Okay, Scott. Take care. Bye-bye.